welcome to Hell of a Pitcher. My name is Andrew Bartlett, and I am one half of your hosts for this wonderful movie podcast about some of the best movies in film history, and if they would qualify, or if they qualify for being our distinction of a film that does a little bit more and is a hell of a pitcher. I'm sitting across the internet, as I do each and every week, from my dear friend, Mr. David Hollingshurst. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much. Pretty excited to sit down and talk about a hereto unwatched Tarantino film for me. Got to watch it for the first time this week. And yeah, going to be an interesting talk as someone who saw it for the first time now, and someone who saw it, I'm guessing, for the first time probably in 1997 and every year since. So it's an interesting dueling of opinions, I think.
Yeah, this is, we're sort of wrapping up our Tarantino this week. And, we wanted to do, as we sort of mentioned last week, we wanted to do a modern Tarantino, or like more recent Tarantino, kind of a middle of the pack, and then an early Tarantino. And this is sort of qualifies us for his earlier work. This was his third film that he wrote and directed based on the novel Rum Punch. And yeah, Jackie Brown was sort of I want to say a slight departure from his first two films. In tone, at least, definitely, there's sort of this underlying, seedy characters, criminal content of characters, I guess. But when it comes to like the tone of a film, this is definitely a bit of a shift for him early on in his career.
Yeah, it's interesting. That is something that I wanted to ask you about when we get into it, was because it's been a while since I've watched early day Tarantino. It's been a long time since I've seen Reservoir Dogs or Pulp Fiction. But now recently we have watched latter days Tarantino, or at least, certainly his most recent in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and in sort of a middle, I guess, number 6 of 9, Inglourious Bastards. And watching this, I was wondering about some of the hallmarks of Tarantino, where they started, how this film sort of fit in, and because it felt reminiscent of the first two, like you say, in some of the content, and that it's sort of slick criminal underworld kind of stuff, but
right.
Yet also a little different in some ways. It didn't seem to have some things that I associate with Tarantino, and well, we won't spoil the conversation. Let's hold off on that. But we will come to all that in due course.
Okay, sounds good. So usually before we get into, we give a little bit of a rundown, and we talked at length in our Once Upon a Time in Hollywood episode, and again in Inglourious Bastards, on sort of Tarantino's history, I guess, as a filmmaker in general. So if you want to kind of hear more about his backstory, be sure to listen to those episodes. But I also want to put out to you, David, usually before we talk, David and I have a little rundown between ourselves before we sit record. And, we make sure that we're on the same page with where we're going. And we usually have a pretty good idea for, revealing to our audience, like how we choose the films we're doing and where we go for them. And so we neglecting to talk about what we're doing next. So I'm just putting that out there for you,
yes.
David.
I have some ideas on that.
Okay, I have some ideas too.
We can have an open forum discussion at the end if you'd like.
I love that. So let's make sure you stick around if you want to hear what we're doing next week. And yeah, Dave, I like that. So just to kind of get this in the back of your head spinning as you think, and we can kind of talk it out at the end of the episode, which I think will be fun. So we'll do that at the end.
Yes,
but before
totally.
that, we got to talk about the movie. We got to find out if it's a hell of a picture. And to do all that, we need the rundown. And this is a perfect film to have a rundown because it came out, almost 30 years ago. So
absolutely.
we need a little refresher if you haven't seen it in a while. So Dave, hit us with the rundown.
I most certainly will. So, Jackie Brown embroils us in a close-knit story of murder, money, exploitation, and survival. When Jackie, an aging stewardess for a lower-rung airline, gets caught with 50 grand and a pretty strong weekend's worth of cocaine, the ATF sees the opportunity to come down on her in order to get at the man she is running cash for, Ordell Robbie. Now, the feds know about Jackie because of a small-time crook named Beaumont Livingston, a man who, unbeknownst to Jackie, also works for Ordell, a man who, like Jackie, was recently arrested and facing a lengthy prison sentence, and a man who, after being bailed out by Ordell, wound up dead in a trunk. So when Jackie learns from Max, the bondsman who picks her up from jail, that she's also been bailed out by Ordell, she suspects Ordell has plans to silence her. But unlike Beaumont, Jackie can see what's coming, and we watch as she deftly maneuvers between cops and crooks with only her guile, good looks, and maybe one friend to see her through alive. Jackie Brown was released in 1997 and based on the novel Rum Punch by Elmore Leonard. It was written for screen and directed by Quentin Tarantino, of course. It stars the legendary Pam Grier as Jackie Brown, Samuel L. Jackson as Ordell Robbie, Robert Forster as Max Cherry, Robert De Niro as Lewis, Bridget Fonda as Melanie, and Michael Keaton as Agent Ray Nicolette. Man, I love me some Michael Keaton. I want to get that in there because we don't get him often enough in film. The film cost a paltry $12 million to make, and it brought in a good return on investment with a box office of around $75 million. The numbers, though, were a step down from Pulp Fiction, which brought in about $200 million 3 years earlier. The film received a lot of praise on release. Roger Ebert called it one of the best of the year. But there were detractors among critics and other filmmakers, interestingly enough. Spike Lee, in particular, took issue with the movie and Tarantino's general frivolous use of the N-word and wondered at his apparent romanticizing of the blaxploitation era. Fairly, I would say. An interesting question to ask. Both Grier and Jackson were nominated for Golden Globes for their performances, but only Forster received an Oscar nom for Best Supporting Actor. The film itself was not nominated for anything at that year's Oscars, not even Best Adapted Screenplay, which just seems plain wrong, honestly. Big winners that year included Titanic, End of List, and despite Titanic's dominance, though, 1997 was full of big films. You had Good Will Hunting, you had LA Confidential, Boogie Nights, Donnie Brasco, As Good as It Gets, hitters one and all. As mentioned, Grier and Jackson did not receive Oscar noms. Leading actor noms, or awards, that year at the Oscars were Jack Nicholson and Helen Hunt, both for As Good as It Gets, with Robin Williams and Kim Basinger taking home supporting awards for Good Will Hunting and LA Confidential, respectively. And that, my friends, is your rundown.
I like that little 97 recap. It was a good year for movies.
97 was a good year. Yeah, it certainly was.
And I heard an interesting take on a podcast recently where they're sort of talking about the Oscars, and they were like, we should do the Oscars like 3 to 5 years after the year. So it's like right now we would do 2022, and we would just sort of like, because it's like a lot of times these Oscar movies, they get you get caught up in the cycle of like, okay, this movie, let's like Titanic, right? Now Titanic is a great film, I would say, and it would like, it's sort of like obviously box office huge, and it just like took over the world there for a while, but like, I don't know, is it as good of a film as Good Will Hunting or LA Confidential or Boogie Nights or sort of any of these? It's like, I don't know. Yeah. Not for me, it's not. But like, it's like the same can be said about everybody gives the typical Crash analogy where it's like Crash won the year Brokeback Mountain was up, and everybody was like, well, they're not ready for like that's type of film yet. But it's also like, who's talking about Crash 20 years later? It's like nobody. People are still talking about Brokeback Mountain, and it's just like. Or maybe you should be a second Oscars. Maybe we should do like an Oscars, like immediate Oscars, and then 10, 20 years later, we do another Oscars for the same year. We like so I don't know. But It's just
I
funny.
like that
It's just
idea. No, I like the
take.
idea of the follow-up Oscar, the revisiting. And I mean, maybe that's sort of the realm of the podcaster. Maybe that's our sort of
Yeah,
contribution
exactly.
to society and to film, is to take these retroactive views of things and, I don't want to say right some wrongs, but at least reopen the discussion.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're right. It's the podcasters that decide. But
We're the
enough
best of
about
us,
90s.
truly.
Yeah, that's right. Enough about the 97 film year and how Titanic shouldn't have won 18 Oscars or however many it won. Let's get into Jackie Brown.
Yeah.
So Jackie Brown came out in 97, Tarantino's third film. And, you mentioned in the rundown how it sort of got a kind of a mixed reaction. I think the critics as a whole sort of liked it, but like reception being like how much money it sort of made, right? Tarantino was coming off of Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs, Dogs being like this sort of like independent darling that people were like, oh my God, he's the next coming of, whoever, Scorsese, or the next massive filmmaker that kind of has this new style and vision. And then he makes Pulp Fiction and just is like, people are blown away by it. And he sort of has a run of like whatever he wants to do at that point, right? He's made Dogs, he's made Pulp Fiction, people love him. Everybody has this, he's this cinephile filmmaker that is like, critics get, but people think people think he's hip and cool. He has this kind of choice of really doing whatever he wants. And I think he stumbles across, or he reads, he said he read like a draft of like Rum Punch. And this was like, I guess it was around the time that Pulp Fiction had come out. So would have been 94. And he reads Rum Punch and he's like, oh man, I want to make this movie. This is great. But he also sort of was like, well, he sort of said, I could kind of, maybe I'll change my mind. Cause they were like kind of still like they were in the cycle for finishing Pulp Fiction or whatever. So he's like, I don't really want to commit to it yet. And, he sort of like read it. And then it sort of kind of stuck with him a little bit, but he was thinking about doing another Elmore Leonard novel. And then he sort of came back to it a couple of years later, and then he was just like, no, it's Jackie Brown. I have to do or Rum Punch. And that's when he wrote it. And yeah, like you said, the reception at the time was a bit mixed, because I think people sort of went in thinking it was going to be more of in line with kind of Dogs and Pulp Fiction. Whereas, as I said, tonally, this is sort of a homage piece versus sort of this glorified like gangster film sort of thing.
Yeah, I think what I remember at the time, because I didn't see this when it came out, but I do remember it coming out. And I kind of remember this sense of apathy in the public, at least apathy relative to the manic response of the first two films. And it was only in recent years, I think that people started to bring this up again and start talking about it and thinking about it as one of his better films. And what I wonder, we touched on this in the opening, that it's kind of different tonally, you said, from Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. But I think in terms of the genre, it's kind of similar. And maybe people were experiencing a little bit of fatigue with just sort of that setting and that idea. Because after this, he does this movie, the response is kind of muted. He takes 5 years before coming back again. And what we get after that 5 years is Kill Bill. And which is a sharp deviation in terms of content and style. And do you think that choice, that really tectonic shift that he made, do you think that was in part a response to the reception of this film, or do you think he was always going there?
To do Kill Bill after it, you mean? Like, or
to do something so dramatically different? Yeah, to do something so dramatically different. Do you think it was because of the muted response to this film? People were a little cool on it, so he thought, I got to do something radical.
No, because I think he makes the films he stays true to himself. I think as a filmmaker, I think he makes the films he wants to make. And if you don't like it or if you have issue with it, like I think that's in the, in the audience. I think he's always been that style of filmmaker. Like, having Final Cut is very important to him. Like, what Final Cut being is, like, he gets the final say on everything in the movie, like how it's going to be cut, how it's going to be presented, which is a tough thing to do for a lot of directors. A lot of directors don't get Final Cut because they're not putting up the money. So, we talked a lot about this when we talked about Blade Runner and, like, the issues that Ridley Scott went through trying to get, like, how many cuts of that movie there's been because the company that put up money didn't want to, wanted it more on the nose that he wasn't a replicant and wasn't, it's like we've gone through all that with director's cuts and everything. But he makes the movies he wants to make. And this is sort of like when you see Reservoir Dogs, you see Pulp Fiction, you sort of be like, oh, this has this has Travolta. And we remember that, like, in Pulp Fiction, like, Travolta, he was like on a downward
Oh yeah,
trajectory. Like, he was not Travolta. Like, he was anymore. He had been this huge star, and now he was just coming down, and he was doing, like, garbage movies. And Tarantino loved him and cast him. And Tarantino has said, like, he didn't look for, like, everybody was like, oh, like, okay, so like you got Travolta, like, and he's back and he's huge and he's back to being the biggest star in the world. And now you've done this with Pam Grier, like, you're putting Pam Grier, who was this huge star in the 70s. And now she's like, you're giving her, like, another look and you're presenting it. Like, who's next? Like, who are you going to, like, revive their career? And he's like, I don't do that when I cast these films. He's like, he has a reverence for these people. He loves their work. And it's like, he says that it's like, people are like, oh, like, where did Pam Grier go? Where did Robert Forster go? And it's like, they didn't go anywhere. It's like, people just stopped casting them because they were not the A-list big movie star or, like, B+ movie star, right? That's who they sort of would send people out for on these castings. And he's like, well, no, I want to see Pam Grier for this movie, or I want to see, you know what I mean? Like, when he cast Jackie Brown, he had it in his mind that he wanted her from the beginning, and he had actually seen her. This is what if a fan he was. He saw her for Pulp Fiction, right? Because he, like, sees he has these actors that he loves that he's like, I want to see them in this part, and he's casting for the part. She went out, and just to go by, like, that he's not just throwing her in the lead because he's, like, trying to, because, like, he doesn't think that she's great for the role and he just loves her, whatever. Like, he writes these roles and he has her in mind, and yeah, I guess what I was saying was that she was in Pulp Fiction. She had auditioned for Pulp Fiction for the same role that was it Rosanna Arquette played? Who was the drug dealer's girlfriend?
You're asking the wrong guy. It's been a while since I've seen Pulp Fiction.
So there's the guy that John Travolta buys the heroin from. He has this, like, like, essentially like a drug addict girlfriend. She's like a skinny white girl. Rosanna Arquette, I think, is who it is. Anyway, she auditioned for that role, and he was like, no, we're not going to work together in this movie. Like, you're not right, but, like, we're going to work together eventually. And then he writes Jackie Brown, and Rum Punch, the lead of Rum Punch was the character is a white woman. And he's like, no, I'm going to make it a black actress. And he just knew that Pam Grier would be perfect for it. And she is. And it's like, it doesn't matter that she's, hadn't worked for 10, 15 years. Like, had worked, but not to the degree that she had worked before, right? She wasn't this huge star anymore. And he's like, well, I'm still going to put her in the movie as the lead. It was the same thought when he cast Robert Forster as he was perfect for the role. And that's why I think it's interesting when you talk about, like, if he had, veering towards Kill Bill after this, it was like, it's because he's making and doing the things that he believes are true to the story that he wants to tell. And he's like, he's obviously known for being, like, a huge, like samurai film, like, connoisseur. Like, he loves those movies. That's what he wanted to make for his next film. And it's like, he was a huge fan of blaxploitation films. And that's just sort of why it's not specifically a black exploitation film, it's like pulling on a lot of those genre, um, yeah, ideas. I don't know if that answered your question. That was a rambling answer, but
I think it did. I'm sure it did somewhere in there.
What I was talking about.
But yeah, I mean, just continuing on, I guess, what makes this film feel different. What separates it from Bastards in particular, we watched it, we discussed that last week, and we mentioned that Bastards, it really lacks connective tissue. Like, it's this very episodic, long time between sort of scenes. You get these massive jumps chronologically in chapters. This movie is quite the opposite. This movie is all connective tissue. We kind of like, we don't miss a minute of this story. And I wonder if that's one critique that some people have of it, that it is long, that it consists almost purely of conversation, and that, you know, a lot of it is, I don't know, you could say that it's not necessarily driving the story in a lot of ways. It's a fair question to ask, you know, do you need every bit of this film? I'm not sure if you do need it. What I am sure of is that I definitely want it, because I could listen to these characters talk like all freaking day.
Exactly. And that's what Tarantino's so good at. It's like, he's so good at writing dialogue, and you just want to listen to them talk. You know, a mundane conversation between Lewis and the little surfer girl, Bridget Fonda.
Melanie.
Never heard Melanie, right? You know, it's like they're meandering about the minutia about, you know, whatever, like getting out of jail, and her, like, you know, drinking like energy drinks and stuff or whatever, and like it's just like this, like what am I listening to? And then next thing you know, they're banging in the kitchen. It's just like but like that conversation is so telling to these sort of characters, because it's such a character driven film, because it's all these unique characters. But like, again, as you said, it's like it's told sort of very chronologically, and very sort of from that moment she gets caught with the Ordell's money to start with. It's like from there to the point of his death and how she steals all the money. It's like we see everything that happens in between, and we don't need to know backstories. We don't need to know how she, like, you know, her the ex. We get tidbits of it when she's getting interrogated. We don't need to know like Lewis's backstory about being like, you know, he did a bank robbery, or Ordell's, or like, you don't need to it's like, it's kind of revealed throughout these conversations that people are having. And that's what makes these conversation moments, like you said, so interesting to watch, even though it might feel like it does drag in moments.
Yeah. And, you know, you mentioned too, well, we talked just now about the chronology of the film, and one thing that this film is missing, and remind me now, because like I said, it's been a long time since I've seen Pulp Fiction or Reservoir Dogs, but do either of those films have that kind of that cutaway style that we see in later films? You know, there's cutaways to different things to sort of fill in kind of exposition in it, and something that's happening in the moment. You get a little bit of narration here and there. Are those techniques, does he employ those in the first two movies? Because he doesn't here. He doesn't do it at all here. And I wondered if the absence of that is maybe what sort of disappointed some people. They were like, oh, you know, he didn't really have all those things that we really enjoyed in the first movies. Was that absent here, or was it just never, did that not come about until Kill Bill? Because it's definitely in Kill Bill, and it's definitely in movies thereafter. Obviously in Bastards, and in Once Upon a Time we see it. And I'm pretty sure it's in Hateful Eight, and yada, yada, yada. Did that happen in Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, or was that an advent of Kill Bill?
Well, that was very much the chronological idea was like, I mean, he does it in Dogs so seamlessly, where, you know, he just jumps around, and that's sort of that Tarantino-esque style where it's like, okay,
right, you
know, the Pulp Fiction begins with the Honey Bunny scene of, you know, them robbing, which is chronologically, I guess that's sort of like middle to end of the film. You know what I mean? If you think about
it's nearer the end. It's definitely nearer the end. Yeah.
Dogs does that too, to a degree, right? That hops around a bit. Not as drastically, but it still definitely does. Like he has those flashback scenes of when we reveal and understand that Mr. White, I think, is the cop or whatever. Like we get that reveal scene, and he fills us in through those. Yeah, he doesn't really do it in Jackie Brown, because like you said, we get all this sort of info and stuff through dialogue, and it's like, like, do we have to see Ordell and Lewis being buddies in Detroit? Like, no, we can get that information through like, through dialogue, I guess. But like you said, it was sort of this first sort of attempt for Tarantino to sort of tell this story from like, beginning all the way through. He doesn't like, I feel like in Kill Bill, he was doing those like, like when he would tell like sort of flashbacks of like, I'm thinking about specifically like the story of Oranishi when he tells that like story of I forget the what's the actress's name who plays Oranishi? Lucy Liu. Jeez, oh my God. I was like, Charlie's Angels. What is he? Yeah, Lucy Liu. And he tells
Charlie's Angels last night, actually. Interestingly enough. Still good.
Whoa.
Still good.
Deep cut. Yeah. And then he tells like her backstory through that anime sequence, which is like super cool and like different and like, okay, that's cool. And yeah, he's sort of like, I feel like he just kind of makes these interesting choices when he feels like the story needs it, but not necessarily in, forcing it, so to speak. Right. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, it's definitely not present here. And I think maybe because this is almost a more conventional film in that way. I don't want to, sure. I'm not trying to diminish it when I say that either. I just mean this is a more, what people would think of as a less unorthodox style to storytelling. And maybe that contributed to the disappointment that people sort of felt with it, or just the mixed response that you talked about. But one of the things that you mentioned,
let me just hop in. Let me just hop in quick for 2 seconds and
Please.
say, I think one thing too to note is just like, again, this goes back to the casting, but just goes back to the character, the direction of the characters. That's not just dialogue. Like, okay, yeah, we get like information when she's getting interrogated about like, she's been arrested before and her husband and like she, and she's got a shitty job and whatever, but it's also in just like how he shoots and frames these characters, how they're presenting. Lewis doesn't have a whole ton of dialogue. I think you can fit his dialogue into like 3 scenes, De Niro, right?
Yeah.
But it's like, we understand his story through how he's like sort of like slouched over and like sort of like kind of almost sleeping, but like kind of awake and listening and just sort of like going along with things. And like, we get this, like we're painting this picture of who this person is through his like physical, he's getting reintroduced into society and like learning about things and just like learning how things work. And just like, same with like, Ordell and how he presents himself and how he's like, just how he talks to other people, but how he carries himself and how he's like, it's not just through the dialogue, it's through the physical actions and then the camera work, right? Like we get introduced to Jackie Brown twice in the film, like from a character being presented to the audience in that like, this is the first time we see them. And it's obviously the first moment of the film. We're held on that long tracking shot, and we get a chance to just stare at this woman and be like, oh, and try to like paint this picture in her head of who she is. Like she's obviously a stewardess, but she's like, looks a bit older. She looks traveled. She, we're doing all this in our head. And it's like, this is our heroine. This is who we are following. This is the person. This is our hero for this story. And then like, then we jump away from her and we're not even with her for like half hour. We're apart from her. And we're like, and then she gets reintroduced again. And when she's walking down from being arrested down the cop, whatever, the kind of that sidewalk to Max. And he's now watching her. And he's us from the beginning. He's watching her and he gets that, I can't remember if it's the Supreme. So, I love you, wouldn't I love you, baby? I don't know if it was that song playing. The Delfonics. Yeah, so that song obviously plays, but I don't know if it's that moment that that song plays for the first time, but he's just watching her, and it's just like, then we see him looking at her, and we're like, oh yeah, she is it. She is the person. Anyways, that was a bit of a tangent, but again, I wanted to point out that it's not just in the dialogue that Tarantino writes; it's in how he shoots and frames, and the characters like just predisposition.
Yeah, well, additional to that is you talked about the song, and in that opening scene, we hear almost the entirety of the the Bobby Womack song across 110th
Yeah.
Street. That is such a long tracking shot of her going into the airport that you have the opportunity to listen to a whole song, and
Yep.
that's something I really like. Honestly, when you got a good tune, man, let it run. And as you mentioned,
It
it
does it
does
at the
give us an
end. Yeah.
opportunity to sort of, yeah, exactly, exactly. It's the first thing we hear, it's the last thing we hear. And I think it comes as a refrain throughout the film, too. And it gives you time to consider her, consider the
Yeah.
music, consider the
Yes.
surroundings, and what that all means. And you mentioned the word exploitation came up a couple of times already.
Yeah.
And again, the aesthetic of this film, well, right away, we see it in the Miramax logo. It is reminiscent of, sort of graphics of the 70s. And it would be easy to think about that just as aesthetic or as homage, because obviously Tarantino does that, a lot. But I think this movie concerns itself with the idea of exploitation in a larger sense in films and beyond. And we kind of
Mm.
see it everywhere. Ordell in particular he's an organism that survives on the very principle of exploitation. He talks openly about how,
Right.
because the gun and film industry have stylized certain weaponry, he can turn around and sell it at a higher markup. And the line he has is, "It's the most popular gun in American crime," and that's actually how they sell this gun. Then he says, "Because of this motherfucker, I'm gonna make $12.50 off this motherfucker." And obviously, I've substituted motherfuckers for N words here for obvious reasons. But the point remains true. He is totally accepting of and willing to capitalize on a system that is based on exploitation. And he assumes everyone does it. Like when he sees that picture of Max and Winston, you got Max, the bail bondsman,
Yeah.
and Winston, his employee. He assumes this to be a facade of friendship. And I love that line. When he sees the photo on the wall, he goes, "Bet it was your idea to take the picture, wasn't it?"
Yeah, I love that. And Zeus is from No Holds Barred, which is an obscure 80s movie. He was
Also from Friday.
Also from Friday, Tiny from Friday. But he's great in this because it's like, again, that's sort of like this interesting choice for actors where it's like, oh man, throw Tiny in there. And that's what I do
Oh, yeah.
find people like he's great in it. He's memorable. When these characters have these kind of bit parts, but are very memorable. Even like Sharonda and like his other Ordell's like other women that he has sort of set up, like when she's doing her Supremes, oh baby, love my baby. It's like this, like
that's right.
It's like, oh, it's like such great.
She do her dance for you.
Yeah, it's like she's not stripping; she's just doing her like Supremes routine, or she's not. It's nothing, and he's just right. Like Lewis is just taking it in, and it's great, man. But it is sort of like you said, like it's a movie sort of based on exploitation in a sense, and like Ordell is exploiting all these women, and he's because he's controlling them in a sense, and Jackie Brown is she's exploiting Max, and it's like she can tell, like she knows from the get-go what Max is about, and Max is not really hiding it, not what about in a bad way, but like it's love at first sight for him. He sees her walking down that sidewalk, as I was mentioning, and he's like, oh fuck, like this is you know what I mean? He's this bail bondsman. He deals with criminals his whole life, and now he's seeing this absolutely stunning woman and then she's like, okay, now how can I use him? And it's like, that's not to mean that the exploiting him isn't nefarious completely, but she can't do what she needs to do without somebody like Max.
Well, that's interesting that you say that. That's really interesting because what I thought of watching this was that there was a distinction between Ordell and Jackie because they're both trying very hard to survive in a difficult world. And the idea of survival comes up quite a
Sure.
bit. It's in the Bobby Womack song, and we'll talk about it some more or later, I'm sure. But I thought what made her great, and the reason why I don't think this film is exalting exploitation or lionizing the exploitation era, is because the hero in this, I think, does what she has to do without truly exploiting anyone. Because she says it at the end of Max. She goes, Max, I didn't use you. I didn't lie to you. She
That's
says that
fair.
very
Yeah.
pointedly, and he agrees. And you are right. Like, there's manipulation there, and she does need him, and she does, like, she's incredible. Like, I mean, her machinations are par excellence. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, fuck, way to go. But I think she maintains an ethic throughout, and I think that's why she's the hero, because she's able to survive, but she does it with a code, or at least a code I think that is more respectable than Ordell. Ordell is like, if it's him or me, it's going to be me. Whereas with her, it's a little more, yeah, like, I didn't use you. I made the choice I had to do. I didn't lie to you. Maybe it wasn't the greatest thing in the world, but I'm going to be contrite about it at the end. And I thought there was a nobility to her that was missing in other characters in this movie, and that's why she's the hero.
Yeah, it's interesting, you mentioned about surviving, and I just, again, getting back to the sort of the casting and like putting Pam Grier, it's like, this goes to show like the surviving of, and like, of just an actor in general, and like the actors have to survive, and like the two leads in this film have like, Robert Forster and Pam Grier, just like they hadn't worked for a while, and they were sort of fell out of the social consciousness, and we're like, okay, you're like this '60s star, and you're this '70s blaxploitation star, and like nobody really thinks much of you anymore, and like, that's what's great about Tarantino. I think he was just sort of like, well, no, they haven't gone away. They're still here. They still want to work, and they can still make great choices and great performances with what they're doing. They're surviving like kind of anybody else in the industry, right? It's not about just like who is the hot person right now. And that's why I think Tarantino talked about like the nominations. He was like very, when they came out with the SAG nominations and the Oscar and the Golden Globe nominations, Pam Grier got one for during SAG and Golden Globes, and Sam Jackson got one for both, and he was like very like happy, but he was like really wanted one for Robert Forster, because he was like, he thinks his performance is great, and then so when he got it for Robert Forster, got it for the Oscar nom again, he was like very very happy, but he wasn't, but then he was sort of upset for Pam Grier, and to a certain degree Sam Jackson, but he sort of said, yeah, Sam Jackson, he's going to be around next year. It's like, we don't know if Pam Grier is going to be around next year, not die, but you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
In a sense, it goes back to like what you're saying, like the character is reminiscent of the actor and the person playing it, which is again why it's such great casting.
Absolutely, yeah. And there is that idea of systemic exploitation in here as well. You talk about it in the film industry, and that is very,
Right.
very real. There's even like a little string of dialogue there where they're talking about managers and agents and the percentage they earn. And that felt just a passing comment on that from Tarantino. And the soundtrack, it's a lot of Motown stuff. And if you know anything about, that era of R&B and soul music, you know that a lot of the musicians were taken advantage of brutally, absolutely brutally. So I think that's there. And of course, everybody in this film pretty much is being exploited by the justice system to some degree. Everybody is getting worked over there. There's all kinds of talk of cops and prosecutors trying to fuck with you. And it just, it's the whole thing is replete with examples of exploitation and just how pervasive it is. And
Right.
it's clearly a very, very purposeful and comment from the film. And what you need to do to survive in that is super important. And we talked about it, how Ordell, he does what he does because he thinks everybody's doing it. And we mentioned the Bobby Womack song, and, everyone is trying to survive, in some cases very literally. And sometimes what we're willing to do, what we're capable of, is based on the choice left to us. And Jackie talks about her options at a few points. It keeps what she want. She keeps talking about her age and where she's at in her career, and what she winds up doing is wildly dangerous. but given the options left to her, the quality of life, it sort of seems like that's the choice. You know what I mean?
Well, I love how they reference too. It's like we're, when you watch this movie. I mean, I watched this movie when I was a teenager for the first time. I don't know if I don't think I saw it right when it came out, but probably soon after. Um, and they talk about her being 44, and like you're a 44-year-old woman, and it's like now I'm looking at that, and it's like we're almost 44, we're 40, and it's like, geez, like that does not seem old, and nor does she like seem like she's really old in this. Max does to a certain degree, but it's like, but again, you can look at why Max would look at somebody like Jackie and be like, oh my gosh, this woman is like absolutely stunning, because he's probably, he's 10 years older than her, and she's been around the block and she knows. And but still, it's sort of that idea that like 44 is like so old, and like what are you going to do for the rest of your life because you're 44? And it's like, geez, it's like that shift has sort of happened too in our culture, I think.
For sure.
I think it's interesting. You mentioned again in the rundown about like Spike Lee's sort of take on this, and like this is something that Tarantino's been obviously criticized with throughout his career, maybe more so in the past few years. With use of the N-word, with like sort of like depictions of, I want to say, females, or depictions of maybe not so much females, but of Black characters. And I don't know. I sort of have issue with it. I mean, that's easy enough for me to say, but I think it's okay to write characters like that, to write characters that you might not necessarily have lots of things in common with, not just with respect to like skin color, but like it's like, look at all the greatest films ever made. It's like, you think that Francis Ford Coppola was actually part of the mafia, like with The Godfather. Like, it's like you can write characters. It's like I can get where Spike Lee is coming from. I just, and I just think I feel like sometimes it's problematic looking back on pieces of art, and you can look back at it with a critical eye for sure. But like, I don't know. I'm curious to hear your opinion on it. Like, he drops the N-word in Reservoir Dogs specifically, and in like Pulp Fiction, like pretty, like, not in the same way it's sort of dropped in this light. And then you could go and talk about like something like Django, which is like some people definitely obviously have a issue with Tarantino telling that story.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell anybody how they should feel about something like this. This is a very personal thing, particularly an African American person who obviously has a much more personal connection with the idea than I would. So their opinion is their opinion, and they are right in it, no matter what it is. As far as I'm concerned, it's certainly not my place to tell them otherwise. What I would say too, though, is that depiction is not endorsement. So just because you have a character speaking a certain way, you have certain things, that doesn't mean that you are saying this is how I feel about it. Sometimes you need to create characters who differ from you, who you need to have that element in there. Maybe is it a little frivolous at times? Yeah, I think it kind of is. Certainly, like in some instances, but again, it's I don't know. I respect people's dissenting opinions on it, and if they do detract from his work because of that, I think they're entitled to that position. So I'll let everyone just sort of have their own take on that, and not weigh in too heavily either way. But speaking of Tarantino's earlier work, and I guess all of his work, we talked how this felt different and yet also familiar in some ways to both latter and early days. And I found that maybe I brought this in with me because we watched it so recently, but there was some kinship with this in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, in that
Yeah.
they both have a strong temporal element to them. And not just in
Right.
terms of style or era, but we talked about in Once Upon a Time the idea of things coming to an end. And I think we see that here as well. Like we said, Jackie is constantly reminded of her age, her underwhelming career status, and how her past hangs over her. That's why she is where
Yes.
she is. She had a previous charge, and that's why she's working for Cabo Air or whatever it is. Like, just the worst of possible job in the airline industry. And we see her and Max have a conversation about getting old, and we see it again with music, like records instead of CDs. And Max points out that records are fine, but you can't get new stuff on records. To which Jackie replies, she doesn't really get new stuff. And even though there's this reverence for the old, there's an idea of new beginnings. We hear about starting over a lot. The phrase starting over comes up in this. And I think that's another indication that Tarantino is not just obsessed with old motifs and ideas. He does love those things, but he's not categorically discounting everything new or championing everything old. There's things he'd like to preserve, and I think there's also instances where advancement he feels is not necessarily improvement. But it's not just, like we said, he's not just saying categorically old is good, new is bad.
No, I don't think so. And but like you said, it's this affinity, this you know um, admiration for the past and things that have come before it. Tarantino has said, and specifically with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, like that he sort of had said that was the film he had sort of been waiting to make his whole career, his whole life, really. He said he had this he had this knowledge of movies and making movies and movie history that sort of like, he said, like, before like IMDb came around, he was like, he's like, I just watched everything and just like had this knowledge of like film. Now you can get knowledge from film from sort of anywhere, and you don't have to have seen everything. And it just sort of like had this wealth of knowledge, and it's like, where can I put this? Where can I finally put all of this? And he puts it into Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But it's the reverence, like I said, to past, and just like being able to pull on older things that just make it, I want to say make it these stories unique, but also it's just the interesting thing is that there's no filmmaker like him. Everybody has tried to emulate him. He's the most emulated sort of director in modern cinema, I think, when because he had such these unique takes on how to tell these stories, and like you see people trying to make movies like him, and it's just so in a sense he is a new beginning. Everything he makes is this kind of new reframing, retelling, this new way of looking at how to make films or how to create films or how to shoot them or do anything. But he's just pulling from all the past, right? Which is such a cool thing to be able to do, right? So I think you're right in saying that there is an idea of like newness to Tarantino, while still having this kind of affinity for the old.
Yeah, 100%. And one of the things I noticed, just keeping with sort of the similarities or the recurrence of traits or techniques, there was a shot when Ordell picks up Beaumont. They go and they have that great scene where they're talking it out.
That's the shot in the film.
And he manages to get him into the trunk, and then he drives around the corner, and to do that, there's I guess it's like a cherry picker or a boom or whatever. I'm not sure what the technical piece of equipment is. It's a boom shot or whatever it is. But as the car drives around the corner, the camera just sort of levitates and looks over the fence into where this vacant lot where he pulls into, and of course he shoots him. And watching that, it was like, oh man, that same shot was used in Once Upon a Time when Cliff gets home to his trailer at the behind the drive-in theater. You get that same levitating shot over the theater screen, and then focusing in on Cliff's trailer. And I think he uses it again in that movie with a couple of sort of shots, like from the front of Rick's house to the back of Rick's house, and just
he does at the very end of the film too.
Exactly, yeah, and
I
really like that. It's very, very cool.
Yeah, he does it when we when he's running through his lines too, and we get introduced to Sharon Tate first going off, and it's like he's practicing his lines, and we see this big, the like that's immediately what I thought of when I thought about Jackie Brown Beaumont scene, Chris Tucker too, like so awesome in those, like he is in one scene and he's just like steals the scene. Hey motherfucker, like he gets in the car and he just gets like, it's like we know what's happening, and it's like you just want to be like, what the like, dude, what are you doing? Like he's obviously good, like just pulling the wool over your eyes, right? Like you're just
well,
like,
it's expertly done by Ordell. I mean, the manipulation there is absolutely brilliant. It's a masterclass in how to manipulate someone. So tip of the cap there.
I mean, it's there's also a great little scene. I was just thinking about just Ordell moments in general, and like you mentioned earlier when it's like he's looking at the picture of like, the bail bondsman and Max, and he's like, I bet it was your choice to do that. If you kind of watch Lewis in the background of that scene, it's just like walking around and he's just like sort of meandering and sort of taking it in, and it's like getting coffee and just like sort of like, it's just like such a cool, interesting shot. It's a cool way to like, you could just have it in the office, but it's like, no, let's have and then he comes in and gets the car keys. He's like, listen to some music. Don't mess with my levels now. Like, like
got him just where I like him.
I gotta like him just where I like him. It's like, it's very, Ordell is, and again, through just brilliant dialogue and writing is how we get a sense of these characters. And then, like you said, when you throw in like a crazy cool boom shot or like great moments, there's a moment too when Jackie's sort of running out of the store and you get that cool tracking shot of her. And it's sort of like, it's the same sort of tracking shot we see at the beginning, but there's this stillness in the beginning, right? She's on the Segway sort of going to and just not moving, and now we're at the peak of the movie and it's like tracking her, but we're running, and then the camera starts spinning around her and we see, she calls out Ray, and it's just like, it's just smart filmmaking, and it's I don't want to say simple filmmaking, but like he's not trying to do too much in those moments either, so that's why they hit hard and they work.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. And it's interesting too, because that air that she affects there of panic and the camera work contributes to that is all a facade. Like, I mean, that is all, that's all part of her scheme, to pull this off. And I mean, it's just, I don't think we've talked enough about, and I'll just say very briefly here, just how well thought through and realized the actual plan is in this movie. I was literally just about to say that. Yeah, really, really well, and also shown to us in a really, really effective way, because it's intricate, but I understand it. You know what I mean? Like when you're watching this movie, I mean, I don't know, maybe this wasn't the experience for everybody, but like, I mean, I thought it was put to you in such a way that it wasn't holding your hand. They didn't dumb it down, but at the same time, you could follow it. And it's not just like, well, how did they pull that off? That doesn't make any sense. Like, no, like I felt like this was a fully realized scheme.
Yeah, I felt so too. And I just felt like everything sort of fell into place perfectly. And you're like, and then it's like, well, how does she get that money out? Oh, then it's like, this where Max comes into play. Then Max comes out. And then it's like, even the happy accidents that happen, and the happy accidents being the deaths of Melanie, Lewis, and then at the end Ordell, which could have been planned or couldn't have, but all of those deaths are just sort of conveniently happen to make the because and the great thing is Ray sort of says that, and when he's interrogating her, he says, we found the $10,000 on Melanie, that she has the marked bill, so that goes to backing up your story. You're like, oh right, like that works. And,
which was
but like
very purposeful by Jackie, obviously.
Yeah, but then like Lewis, nobody planned for Lewis to kill her, so it's like
nope.
because that, obviously that's like, okay, that's good. Now she can't, but she still had the money on her. And then Lewis gets capped by Wardell of all people. So it's just like, and that scene too. I love him, Bridget Fonda and Robert De Niro in the department store. And he's like, you fucking bitch. And he's just grabbing her. He's like, come on. Like, and he's just like trying to keep it together. And he's just like complete psychopath. And he's like,
did you find he actually kind of looked like his character from Cape Fear in that? He kind of looked like the Cape Fear guy. He had this slick back hair and the shirt on. And I was just like, oh man, I wonder if that was by design.
Yeah, like I love how groveled and grizzled he is, but then it's like, I just love he gets the phone call from Wardell. He's like, what the fuck are you still doing there? Like, he's like, you're late. He's like, she won't come out of the room. Like, I don't know. He's like, go grab that, drag her out of there. And he's like, she's just peppering him and just like egging him on. And it's just like, and that's what, like, those moments in film where there's such like a guttural reaction as a character, like, he's like, don't say another word, just don't say like one more thing, don't say one more thing, and then just caps her. And it's like, it's such a brilliant moment for that character, and it's like, it's shocking, but it's also like kind of hilarious. It's like, she's Lewis, is it this eye, Lewis? Lewis, where is it? Dumb fuck. And she's just like, and you're just like, don't fucking say it. And when he's trying to explain it to Wardell after, you have to shoot her? You couldn't hit her? She's like, what am I supposed to do? He's like, what do you want me to do? Like, she's it's like, I can't talk to her. And he was egging me on. And anyway, it's like, it's brilliant, man. It's such brilliant writing. It's such brilliant moments. And man, yeah. I think, okay, so we've talked a lot about it. We're running up an hour now. I want to know, do you think this is a hell of a picture? Can Tarantino go 3 for 3?
Yeah, we prefaced this episode by saying that I had never seen this movie and that I was coming in fresh. And we talked about how this movie has grown on people, including you, I think, over the years.
Absolutely.
This movie suffered in the moment, I think, for reasons we outlined earlier. And watching it now without the burden of all of that, I think I was able to appreciate it on first watch the way that other people have come to with the passage of time and over multiple watches. I think I was sort of free of the things that maybe hampered them. So yeah, I love this movie, and I think it really stands out in his filmography as kind of a weirdly conventional contrast to his typical stylings. And yeah, hell of a picture for me. I don't mind saying it, 3 for 3.
I love how he, this is a real love story, kind of. You can kind of look at it from the music he uses, this relationship between these two aging actors, but these two aging characters, but love crossed or star-crossed lovers that just will never really end up being together, need something from one another. And it is really sort of one of the more emotional pictures of Tarantino's career as you look at the whole, right? I think I would put this sort of, when you think about that, on the same level as Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I think Kill Bill Volume 2, if you want to split them in two, has that sort of element, but I don't really think to this degree. And then Death Proof, I don't think it does that, nor does Black Bastards or Hateful Eight. Like, I think this is sort of when it comes to like love stories, this is really, really capes the cake for him. So, but I think it is one of his films that gets better with time, for sure. And again, like you said, I rewatch this once a year and I'll find things about it that I just like, oh man, that's so cool. And that I forgot about this. And then I'm rewatching it. I'm noticing things that are like, the restaurant that Cliff and Rick go to towards the end of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that sort of Mexican restaurant that they go into and they get absolutely blackout drunk at. That's the same restaurant that, the exterior anyway, that Pam or that Jackie Brown walks out of when she meets Ordell. I'm pretty sure. Or it's like it's in the movie either way. Yeah, they're like when they leave. I think it's Ordell and I'm just like, oh yeah, shit. There's the From Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So yeah, even stuff like that you're finding the first time when you rewatch these films. They have such great rewatchability, and I love them, man. I think Jackie Brown's up there for me in my list for Tarantino. So I'm going to say Hell of a Picture as well. Tarantino 3 for 3. And I think that's a great place to leave off on Tarantino, because I think being 3 for 3 is great. And then we can, as we've mentioned, he's done 6 other films, and we can revisit them and see if he can keep his streak going later on down the line.
Yeah, we better not do Death Proof.
What? Man, you got to rewatch Death Proof. It's great, man.
Yeah, you know what? I'll rewatch it. You're right. I will rewatch it, and I'll give it a fair shake.
Eventually.
But I can tell you my feelings in the moment were pretty hard. I did not care for it.
Yeah, it's a a love story to stunt people. So
yeah, that's fine. I just quite honestly, I thought it sucked. Like that was my feelings when I watched it. I was like, man, this is trash. And so I should go back and revisit it with new eyes, because the way I watch films has changed. So I think it's only fair. But yeah, it'll be operating at a deficit. That's for sure, because of my initial feelings on it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've had films like that before. Actually, a lot of them that upon first view, and I'm like, this movie's trash. And then I rewatch it. I'm like, man, I love this movie. If you kind of try to watch it from a different point of view or different perspective, it's funny how films can do that. So, we talked a lot about Tarantino. We always try to find some sort of segue into our next line of films. So, we did a loose, Austin Butler was in Once Upon, The Dune Part 2. He's in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. That'll get us into Tarantino. Yeah. As we talked a lot about Jackie Brown, and I had it sort of simmering in the back of my head, is there anything that jumps out for you for what we want to do for our next run of films?
So I had 2 thoughts.
Okay.
First was sticking with Tarantino, but not in a directorial way. I was looking through his filmography and going down through things that he was affiliated with, either as a producer or what have you. And I don't know how actually strong this connection is. I think it's probably something where he was one of the people involved in bringing this film to North America. I don't think he had anything to do with production initially, but it's a movie that I have long loved. It's certainly in a, I don't know. I won't narrow it down to top 25 or something like that. But if I were to compile a top list for me, I would have to give this film consideration anyway. It is Hero, the Jet Li Chinese epic, historical epic that Tarantino really championed and was a big proponent of. I remember when it came out. So I would love to talk about that film, and I think there's some interesting places we can go from that film, which we can talk about further. But my other thought was that since this movie came out in 1997 and we ran through the list of all the hitters in 1997, a movie that we have talked about doing since we started this show is LA Confidential. And I would love to talk LA Confidential and maybe have that trigger us into a run on film noir, something that we've discussed. So those were my 2 thoughts. We could either go Hero, and I think there's an interesting place to go from there, or LA Confidential, and I think there's an interesting place to go from there. What are your opinions?
All right, so I sort of had 2 thoughts as well. The first thought was, now Hero is interesting because I've never seen Hero, and
you've never seen Hero?
Though I am aware, yeah. Crouching Tiger, I've obviously seen, not obviously, but I've seen that, and that's sort of in the same, is that the same director or the same vein or the same?
I don't know if it's the same director. It did come out around the same time, and it definitely had similar techniques in terms of the martial arts and the way, that was when sort of the wire kung fu phase was really kicking in around the time of the Matrix and stuff like that. Yeah. And it definitely had that historical epic quality to it, but but we will say it's vaguely similar. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, so that definitely interests me. My initial thoughts was like, okay, you got De Niro in a you know, jumping off the Austin Butler train of the supporting actor. De Niro's in a supporting role in this, but maybe we jump to De Niro in some leads, and that'll get us maybe into some Scorsese. Like maybe we can do a little run of De Niro leading Scorsese films, Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, like you just mentioned, Cape Fear. The list goes on and on, even up to The Irishman. They've had so many collaborations. But maybe I think what maybe interests me more, and I think this answers our question, is because that was my first thought, and then my second thought was, and I'm not lying, literally LA Confidential as well. When you were listing off the films at the start and you said LA Confidential, and I know that you and I have both talked about wanting to do a run of film noirs. And I think this is a great jumping off point, being they were both, Jackie Brown was made in 97 and LA Confidential was made in 97. And we have a sort of like this joint list of film noirs we'd love to talk about. And we haven't really talked, we talked a little bit about sci-fi, but we haven't, dived into like 3 films of a film genre. So, I really like that. Well, I guess we have. We get with the Matrix and we did
Blade Runner and Total Recall.
And so we did sci-fi. So we've done genre stuff before. So yeah, ignore my last comment. But, there's lots of genres. So
that's true.
But so and I love it. So I think the fact that we both thought went to LA Confidential is maybe we go to LA Confidential and then maybe start this little run of some film noirs over the years and get into that cool genre. I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. No argument here.
All right, sweet.
But sorry, we got to do Hero at some point. We got
okay. Heroes on the table.
I'm gonna be firm on that one. Yeah, Hero's got to be on the list.
Also, just let people know, send us, I get some messages sometimes. I'm sure you do too, David. And it's like, oh, do this movie or whatever. Like, keep them coming. Like, it's always getting stored in the files. We love hearing from you guys, and you're like, opinions or thoughts or different takes, and let us know and follow us on all the socials and, keep this train going. Hell of a picture.
Yeah, and if we can get enough traction on social, maybe we could even open it up to a poll or something like that. If we have a few options or something like that, it could be, we could let the people decide. We could be a very democratic podcast in that way.
I love that. That's a great idea. Okay, so for David Hollingsworth, my name is Andrew Bartlett. We'll see you guys all next week for LA Confidential. Get rewatching it. It's a great film. And we'll figure out if it's a hell of a picture. And this has been a hell of a picture.